Welcome back to Outgrowing the Good Christian Girl, and we are in our debrief episode with me and James talking about this segment on purity culture and sexuality. So I guess my first question for you, James, is what did you believe about sexuality when you were growing up, and has that changed at all? And if so, why? That's a long question. That's like 3 questions in one.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to be able to really recall with a lot of nuance. I do know that, traditional homeschooled Christian home there wasn't a lot of talk about sex.
True.
In fact, I was listening to these episodes singing, wow, this is such a wonderful conversation. I don't think I've ever heard such an explicit talk about sex.
I know, right?
That wasn't crass. So, I was in a fraternity in college and a non-Christian college. So I've had a lot of very interesting exposure to male expressions of sexuality. But all that to say, I think I was definitely concerned about lust as a kid, as a young boy, to the point that I think it colored a lot of my interactions with the opposite sex and made it very difficult for me to have what I would say like genuine female friendships.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how much of that I would say is lust related.
Yeah.
But certainly one of my takeaways from, and I don't say, well, it was because my church said this or was because my parents said that. All I can really speak to is, when I was growing up, this is what I thought. And, what I thought was, hey, pornography is wrong. Lust is wrong. I feel an attraction to girls. I have no idea how to act on it. Sure. So I think the only thing I can really recall clearly is that I was just very like, oh no, what always asking myself about attraction.
Okay. Yeah, I really liked how she was saying in there, like, noticing isn't attraction. And even the whole, I always thought, whoever I marry is going to have eyes for only me. He's going to, there could be, there's gorgeous women, Victoria's Secret models, all in the room. And he's only going to look at me. He's not going to want to notice anyone else. And I think that, again, was equating lust with noticing, which Sheila talked a lot about in her podcast. Lust is not the same thing as noticing, and noticing is human. And it just put a lot of pressure on a guy. Putting it, I think a healthy marriage is a guy is just going to stare at me all day long. And that's just weird. So the next question I have is, what do you believe about a healthy biblical sexuality now? What are your thoughts on it as far as we're talking heterosexuality here?
I don't know that I have a great answer for this. It's interesting because I've read a lot of the books that Sheila criticized, and I think her criticism was right. But when I read, I sort of read quickly, and I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the nuances. So I think where I had always thought, girls, the wife might not like sex as much, and the guy, should have. Is going to want more sex. I'd always sort of thought that was true. But I think one big takeaway is appreciating how some little comments that, especially men can make about sexuality can be really damaging to women.
I think for me, I was asking the question for a while, Kat Harris had been asking, is sex designed to be only in marriage? And I remember as a teenager asking that and being where does it say that in the Bible? And that's a question we get a lot on our videos. It's where does the Bible say to save sex for marriage? And people will tell me, when it talks about sexual immorality, that groups anything outside of marriage. And I really liked how Kat Harris talked about it, how there's this invitation to sex being in marriage only. And that she said, I can clearly see that invitation in scripture. And I thought that was a great way to put it, because I think even how in the Bible, there was tons of polygamy going on. And then in the New Testament, Paul's if you want to be a deacon, you got to have only one wife, It's even in the New Testament church, there were people with multiple wives. And so it almost seems like a movement toward this monogamy of one person for life. It feels like it's moving that direction throughout the story of the storyline of scripture. So I guess like it was just interesting to hear Kat's perspective on that and the study that she's done, because I know there's a lot of like when the Bible talks about sex, there's a lot of power dynamics at play, and that definitely colors how we can interpret what the Bible's message about sex is. But I think there's, like Kat said, there's this invitation to sexuality being reserved for within marriage, and I don't know. I guess I want to explore it more on my own now. It's not something I've really studied a lot. Because I'm married now, but
yeah, it was interesting. Until that podcast, I had never thought there was any question about this at all. Like I had always thought this was, and this is that this was just, it was black and white. You shouldn't have sex before marriage. Very obvious from the Bible. I guess to me, it's like you read the Bible, and the Bible definitely values sex and values marriage, and sex is designed for marriage. Like to me, that's like, yeah, God loves us. It's like a very obvious thing. So that's not to denigrate or say, hey, if you're questioning this, you shouldn't go on your own kind of journey of exploring what the Bible says and what the Bible means. Because certainly all the things that you mentioned about what we read about in the Bible and, the different, how different sex was in society back in, the ancient world 2,000 plus years ago. All of that is true. But for me, that's not something that ever like troubled me or bothered me. If anything, it was almost too defining of a mark. Like I definitely related to what Kat was saying. Like I was definitely like silently judging people who like
I totally did that too.
Shared a bed or slept over or and it seems like, you want to be in our Christian group in college, you better not be like getting drunk or sleeping with your girlfriend. Like these are the defining Christian characteristics. Right. And, while I think it's important to be set apart and to be holy, I think I liked what Kat said is, can we be human? Can we have space for other people to be human and to be on a journey?
Yeah,
and I think that's a very important point to keep in mind, not only for the topic of sexuality, but whatever other topic where we might have a pharisaical bent. That's at least for me, where it's like, well, I'm saving myself for marriage, and I can't believe that you people aren't. Again, not that I would actually say that, but I thought it, and it colored how I viewed the world, and I think it colored how compassionate I could be towards people.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. And I think for me, like, as I've thought about it, and again, this isn't something I've studied in depth, but I think as I've thought about it and listening to Kat's podcast and all that, I guess in a similar way, Kat said, I studied this, and I decided, I do want to save sex for marriage. And I think, like, obviously we've been married for a while now, but I think if I were to go back and do it again, I would still save sex for marriage. I think that to me, that would still be a way to honor God in my relationship. So for us, like we talked about in our recent video, there was never been a point where we're like, man, if we were having sex before marriage, our relationship would have been so much better. I don't feel that. And I feel like it was actually very beautiful and special to save it. That being said, we didn't date for years and years. We weren't like high school sweethearts. That would be really hard.
Yeah.
That would be, you'd really, I don't know, that would be really hard to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we wrestled in our sort of, year and a half long engagement with like, well, how far is too far? What should we be doing when we're like showing physical affection to one another? Like, that's a tough thing to navigate.
It is.
And
snowball, like physical relationships, God made to snowball,
Yeah. And something else, I never rewind podcasts to listen to stuff again. And this is probably the first time, and the one with Kat that I listened to, she was referencing a book. And she said, rather than thinking of sexuality as like a journey to this fixed destination, i.e. penetration, maybe it's better to think of sex as like a combination or an amalgamation of experiences. And I think especially when you think about the way that Sheila broke down intercourse.
Yeah,
and like
that was
when you
so
said
good.
Like, hey, did you have sex last night? Well, what do you mean by that?
I almost like spit my water out.
I was like, what do you mean, did you have sex last night? But the way she broke it down and the idea that, intercourse can happen without any kind of emotional involvement or physical pleasure or intimacy for a woman, I was like, that's true.
Yeah.
That is possible. And is that, especially when juxtaposed with Song of Solomon, like, is that really the kind of mutual pleasure that God has designed? I mean, I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, all that to say is I think the idea when we think of, hey, we're saving sex for marriage, we have to think about a lot more than, oh, let's make sure the penis doesn't go into the vagina.
Exactly.
As long as that doesn't happen, we're good.
We're good. Yeah, that's true. And also, like, being on that journey of, like, growing in physical intimacy, like, because that started before we got married. You know, like, we didn't have sex until we got married. And there were other things we didn't do till we got married. But, like...
But we did more than holding hands.
Right. We loved our makeout sessions. And, like, I don't regret that at all. Like, I'm so glad we let it, like, grow slowly and naturally. And it almost felt like having that, like, no sex until marriage forced us to let it slowly grow naturally instead of just, like, jumping all in week 2, you know what I mean? Which could have very easily happened. And so it felt like it forced us to build this intimacy slowly, which was really special and beautiful. So, okay, my next question is, let's talk about the modesty piece Sheila talked about.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to, what were your thoughts on
Well,
that?
modesty was a big deal,
Yeah.
like growing up in our conservative church. But I don't think it was ever a big deal for what guys were wearing. I mean, although my mom would sometimes say, those pants are too tight.
To you?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you do have a great butt, so.
We used to, like, roll our eyes. We'd have to turn around in our pants. We'd have to squat down. My mom she was concerned. But I definitely...
I love that she
think
did that for you and your brother, too,
yeah,
not just
but
your sisters.
But I think that they definitely... I mean, maybe I'm misremembering. I think that it would be better probably to ask them. I think it was definitely, modesty is about what girls wear.
Yeah.
Like, it can't be
That's
too
how it always
tight.
was
Like,
taught for us.
no cleavage, no midriff.
Right.
I don't know that I have any funny anecdotes to share, but it was definitely like, we dressed different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like...
No bikinis.
Oh my gosh, bikinis. I remember someone we knew and were close with and was this amazing woman of God. She wore a bikini on the beach and my mom was like, that shows you, like, someone's heart. Actually, maybe my mom didn't say that. That's what I remember her saying. My mom tells me I remember a lot of things wrong, though. My mom now wears bikinis herself, which is hilarious. But anyway, there was this very
would you describe it as a bikini or a two-piece, sweetie?
Sports bikinis, like a sports bra kind of thing. She's an athlete, so. But anyway, so there's...
I think if your mom listens to the podcast, she will probably take exception to the way that you described her and what you remember, which is pretty typical for Tiffany and her mom. Tiffany's like, Mom, I can't believe that this happened when I was a kid.
Tiffany was like, that never happened.
I'm not sure that happened, Tiffany. Or maybe that happened to another sibling, but not to you. Tiffany's like, I'm so sure.
Anyway.
And Tiffany wonders why I question her memory.
I think my memory is perfect.
Of course, everyone does.
Anyway, back to the topic at hand, bikinis. They were like the devil, like the sin of sins.
Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting, like, we put so much emphasis on things like modesty, when what is the main message of the Bible? Like, it is not about modesty. Like, the main themes are, like, justice and, like, caring for the poor and the widow and speaking up for the oppressed, or
worshiping God,
loving God, like, loving each other. Like, and you could say modesty falls into loving each other, but I think it actually...
Or holiness.
Right. But I guess I don't think modesty, the way we were taught it, really does fall into that.
To me, it's overemphasized, and I think Sheila made this point. If you're talking about modesty and lust, a lot, especially to adolescents, that's going to be, like, on their mind a lot.
Yeah, that's true.
And the more it's, like, put on your mind, this is a big deal, this is a big deal, this is a big deal, the more, like, hyper focused you can be on it.
Yeah.
And I definitely remember reading something that talked about, like, how, like, you have to be so careful the way you dress your daughters in church, because like the men who see them, like, in church, like, and as I read that as an adolescent, I thought, well, I have sexual feelings towards women. Like, I see a woman and I think, ooh, like, not necessarily I want to have sex with her, but my body feels different than when I see one of my friends.
Yeah.
And so
And instead of teaching that as normal.
Right. Like, oh yeah, that's normal. It's like being hungry. But,
right, which it is.
We need to learn how to love and respect one another.
Yeah. But instead we're taught as like, oh my gosh, it's like this horrible sin.
Yes,
and like women have to protect you from
feeling,
this. Yeah, it's so messed up. But like, I think too, hearing that message as like a woman, like that's disgusting. Like you're telling me that I'm responsible for my friend's dad's sin? Like...
See, it was never said like that.
Right,
so it's like you
message.
miss the insidiousness of it. But that is the takeaway.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I think a lot of people just, like I would say myself included, just didn't realize. Hey, when you put all this together, the result is a pretty insidious message towards women.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times it was just repeated without really thinking about how is all of this, what these young women are hearing, really going to affect them? What are they going to take away?
Also, the fact, like, people are like, modesty, like, you know, situational ethics is saying you can dress different in different places. But we tell people, which isn't true, but we tell people that based on their body type and how attractive they are, depends how modestly they have to dress.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Like, if you're an attractive woman, you have to be way more careful, and more people are going to tell you you're making people stumble, where someone could be wearing the exact same thing with a different body type, and no one says anything to her.
Oh, wow.
It's messed up. That is, yeah. Anyway, there's just, it's been like a very, why can't we just treat sex as like, this is normal? God created this. Like our bodies react this way, not because we're sinning, but because we're sexual beings too, designed in the image of God. Like, you know what I mean? Like, why can't there be this freedom? And also like not to make it a salvation issue, like Kat was saying, like, whether you save sex till marriage or not is not a salvation issue, and it doesn't guarantee you're going to have an amazing marriage. The people we met with who were like our premarital mentors said, you know, one thing we want to share with you is a lot of couples who are saving sex for marriage have this idea, like, we've done everything right now, like God's going to give us this amazing marriage. And they're like, that's just not true. Like,
yeah, it is true not only for sex, but also for a lot of things. There's like this emphasis
like,
on
I earned
like,
this or something.
yeah, if we did it all right up until this point, marriage is just going to be flow naturally. It's going to be easy.
And they were like, everyone struggles like at different points in their marriage.
In different ways.
And there's
no
way around that.
Struggle as like a sign of failure or like a lack of holiness.
Right. And so I hear a lot of people, if I didn't save sex till marriage or if I masturbated, because that's like a big taboo thing in church circles, which we've talked about that in other videos. I'm not convinced that it's totally wrong. I know I always lose followers when I say that, but I feel like people need to know, like, we're not under this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Kat's perspective, the way that she couched it was great. Is like, let's hold this like a diamond.
Yeah.
Like, let's look at it from different sides. And I think that no matter what perspective you start with and no matter what perspective you end with, that is a really healthy way to think of things.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, you're questioning this, I really question you as a person. Like, I think you should say, hey, discussion is not the same thing as, you know, denying the faith.
Yeah.
Like, we can talk about things. We can, as our counselor says, you can play with the ideas. Play with the ideas. See what you learn. See what you think. I don't think, especially, you know, maybe that's not a great thing to tell a 16-year-old, but certainly as adults.
I think it's better than the shame we grow up under.
Well, yeah,
there's a lot of people who, I mean, I know plenty of women who masturbation started, like, without even knowing that that's what it was. And there was nothing, like, it was so... I don't know.
Everyone's story is different.
So different. Yeah. And then other people feel like they're in bondage to masturbation. And so it's so different for each person. And we have to stop giving these black and white answers that leave people feeling shame. Anyway, well, not that there's no black and white answers. I'm not saying that. I'm getting on a rabbit trail. Going back to my original point. So like this idea of like, if I haven't saved sex for marriage or I've masturbated or whatever, then is it going to ruin my marriage? Am I worth less or something? And the answer is no. That is not what it means.
Yeah, we're broken people and God redeems us.
And we all bring brokenness of whatever kind it is into our marriage and we work through it together. No matter how quote unquote right you've done things or not. Like whether you followed your evangelical upbringing to the T or not. Like we are all going to bring brokenness in and we're all going to have to work through it. And that becomes shared history and a bond between you and your husband.
Yeah.
So it becomes something beautiful if you work through it together. Yeah. Was there anything else we wanted to talk about?
So there was one thing that I had thought, you know, in like a lot of times I get a little off put by people, sometimes even you, who say, well,
Sure.
because of purity culture this and because of purity culture that. And like, you know,
he's like, sometimes, sweetie, it's like when everything's in it. Wait, what is it?
what, you're holding a hammer and everything's a nail.
Yeah.
So,
About
but
purity
what
culture.
I thought about in listening to Kat's podcast, and certainly to an extent with Sheila's, was I think the mistake that the church made, you know, back in the day, was instead of looking, what does the Bible really say about sex and sexuality, they looked at like the crazy hypersexuality that was going on in mainstream culture and said, ooh, let's react to this.
Interesting.
Because let me tell you, I've seen a lot of very negative sexuality in my college experience. You know, I was sort of the observer to, you know, people talk like sexual assault, girls getting pushed by older guys to go way farther than they wanted to.
You saw that happening, or you heard about it afterwards?
Heard about it secondhand, like guys saying awful, awful things about girls and really demeaning them.
Yeah.
Like, so from my perspective, that was, I'm not saying that purity culture couldn't be so toxic for some people, but there was a lot of toxicity there too. And so, but I think unfortunately, the church was like, whoa, like, and like, you think church can objectify women and like have male dominance, like talk about fraternities and sororities. My freaking goodness. Like way worse. I thought. Maybe not for everyone, but for some people, again, like evangelical church wasn't bad for everyone, but for some people it was bad.
Yeah.
You know, the same thing with like mainstream college. But all that to say, like, one of the things I found so refreshing about Sheila's podcast was like, the Bible has a book that talks about sex, Song of Solomon. Let's talk about that, and like that being the picture. And I think as Christians, that's what we really need to get back to, is what is like, not like, what are we saying in opposition to the world or in opposition to purity culture, but like, let's draw from the source, the Bible, and like the belief that God designed us, and God designed us with intention. And he designed us beautifully, and he designed us to experience pleasure. And I think when we focus on what the Bible is pointing us to, I feel like that's going to take us to a much better place than trying to just respond to a lot of the negative views of sexuality that are out there, of which there are many.
That's a good point. Well, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of this segment? And next week we start our final segment in season 2 of this podcast, which is all about social justice. So I'll see you next week for that. Love you guys. Bye.